welcome everybody on this nice rainy day. And David, thank you for being here. I have to go on because there's so much to say, and then just shut me up. David Margolick. Okay, first of all, the quotes, some of the quotes for this book. David Denby in The New Yorker called it a portrait of an unstoppable genius and a cultural history of a medium coming to life. Margolick is an ideal cultural historian and makes the achievements of Caesar and his gang shine through. Esquire called the book Whip Smart, a nuanced appreciation of Caesar's comedy and the overall atmosphere of TV's early days. The book is a finalist for the Penn Jacqueline Bograd Weld Award for Biography, Mazel Tov. And so David writes, this is your story, Uncle Goopy. So David writes for the New York Times and for Vanity Fair. He's an acclaimed biographer, The Promise and the Dream, the untold story of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. He's a cultural historian. Strange Fruit, the biography of a song. A book, I have to say, David, I should have published this book, I'm sorry to say, but hailed by the New York Times as a book suffused with grace, power, and dignity, tribute, elegy, homage, and cultural history. PW called Strange Fruit a superb piece of cultural history. I just want to say a few words about this book because it's such an amazing book and story. It's about Billie Holiday's haunting lament, considered to be the first important song of the civil rights movement, and the first to directly attack through music the lynchings of the South, and the odd, wonderful, surprising connection to the man whose lyrics they were. I'm not going to give a whole lecture on this because I really want you to come back actually in the fall to talk about this book, if you would.
Unfortunately, it's always timely.
Yes, Abel Maripol, a white Jewish DeWitt Clinton, where my father went to high school, New York high school teacher, who wrote the song, Strange Fruit, first as a poem, then went on to influence generations, black and white. Maripol, under the name Lewis Allen, wrote a poem, Bitter Fruit, that was inspired by a horrendous photograph he'd seen in the 30s of two black men who were hanged from a tree, surrounded by white men in fancy clothes. Maripol, an amateur composer, set the poem to music. It was given to a young Billie Holiday, just starting to sing at Cafe Society down at Sheridan Square in the Village, and then the only integrated nightclub in New York City. Holiday became a star, and Strange Fruit was heard by millions. And Margolick's, David's book, looks at the life of the song and how 12 lines of lyrics, a poem with an unobtrusive score, captivated millions, really. And one final note that's just too good to let go. What makes the story so great is that Maripol, a member of the American Communist Party from 1932 to 1947, and sympathetic to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were horrendously convicted and executed for espionage in 1953. Later, with his wife Anne, adopted the Rosenbergs' two sons. I'm going to start to cry. Orphaned after their parents' executions, both children took Maripol's name. So back to Sid Caesar, and by the way, all of the above is not totally unrelated to the period and success of Sid Caesar. So David has written the definitive biography of Sid Caesar, considered the founding father of television comedy. Caesar ruled the never-ending vast universe of television for roughly a crucial transitional decade from 1949 to 1957, and we'll go through all of the permutations of Caesarhood as we talk. I just want to say, Mel Brooks described Caesar as a golden boy, as an artist, as Matisse. Einstein was a fan. Hitchcock thought him the funniest performer since Charlie Chaplin. And by the spring of '54, Sid Caesar was the most influential, highly paid, and enigmatic comedian in America. And I can go on, but let me just say that, let me get back here for a second. And so David is here to talk about the man, his genius, his work, And so let us begin. Thank you again for being here.
Let me share a personal anecdote, because I'm one of the oldest people in the room. What most of you will not know, was the Saturday night ritual of watching your show of shows. We didn't have a television when your show of shows first came on, and family friends invited us every Saturday night to see your show of shows. And it became such an important cultural event. That was the first time I saw television, was your show of shows. And I fell in love with all of them. And it became such a part of the culture. Nobody now can understand the place that that show had in the cultural history of America in 1950.
So
Nobody can understand it if you weren't there.
And it's something,
I was there.
It's something that I've tried to explain, and lots of people, like your family, didn't have television sets yet, and many of them were convinced to buy their first TVs because of...
We were. I told my parents,
of Sid Caesar.
if they can have it, why can't we have a TV set?
Well, yeah, and Isaac Asimov was another one. You know, he thought TV was mostly junk, and he wasn't going to watch it. And this astronomy professor at Harvard invited them over to watch your show of shows, and that convinced him to buy a television. And the other thing that I would mention about that, you know, you don't have too many, I don't feel as if I have many real breakthroughs in reporting a book. It's mostly pretty hard work. But every once in a while you have an inspiration. And I realized that I should call Newton Minow, the man that described television as a vast wasteland, a few years later to see how he felt about your show of shows and Sid Caesar. And it turned out that he and his wife also couldn't agree on whether to buy a TV or not, and they bought their TV to watch Sid Caesar. And it was only a few years later, by which point Caesar was off the air, in the Kennedy administration when he became the FCC commissioner. Only then, when Sid was off the air, did he describe TV as a vast wasteland. It wasn't before.
But David, you're too young to do what I did, which was to watch show of shows when it happened.
You have that on me,
I
for sure.
have that on
Yeah,
you. But
yeah.
what inspired you to write the book then? Because you weren't there when history was happening. And
Well, you know, I wasn't around when Strange Fruit was written either. I mean, sometimes you have to play catch up.
But it's hard. But it's hard to find.
It's very hard. It's very hard to find topics. And Alti, my very patient publisher here, will remember that when I signed up for this book, Jonathan Rosen, who was the culture editor of The Forward, was commissioning them. And he just said, why don't you write a book for the next book series, which this was originally a part of. And I thought on a Jewish topic, I had written about a lot of schmerz. And I thought that maybe I should laugh a little bit, so I wanted to write about a comedian. And I think Groucho Marx was already taken. Yeah. And I knew that Sid Caesar was famous, and I knew that he was highly respected and very influential, but I didn't know the story. So I was curious about it, and I had gone to a testimonial for Sid several years earlier, which left me even more baffled. Mel Brooks was the principal speaker that night, and everybody was talking and Carl Reiner sent in a video, and Larry Gelbart sent one in, and everybody was singing Caesar's praises that night. And then this very decrepit old man got up and did a little bit of his double talk, made little sense in English, but managed to say some things in German and Italian, and, you know, his double talk. And it was puzzling. And so I knew that there were a couple of great stories here. There was the story of who he was and how he became so influential and what his gifts were. And then there was the story about what the hell happened to him. So that, you know, there was a double-pronged story, and that was hard to resist, Foster's, which is why I did it.
But did you find recordings of those original shows that were Kinescope?
Yeah, I mean, the rumor was that, you know, like so much of early television, they weren't saved. Like if you want to go back and watch a lot of early television, like almost all of the Tonight Shows in New York, were not saved. It's criminal. Television had very little self-respect in that era. But most of Caesar's shows were saved, either by Caesar or by Max Liebman, who was the producer of the Admiral Broadway Review and Your Show of Shows. And so there were copies of most of them, either at the Paley Center or the Library of Congress or in Caesar's collection. Caesar was the only person who saved Caesar's Hour, the successor show to Your Show of Shows, and in some ways more important. Some of his greatest sketches were on that show. And somebody went, and Albert Goldman, the biographer of Lenny Bruce, among other people, was going to do a Sid Caesar book and went to interview him in Los Angeles, and Caesar showed him all the recordings for Caesar's Hour, and Goldman wrote afterward, had there been a hurricane, the record of the show would have been wiped out. They were the only copies, and they were sitting in a shed by the pool.
Oh, God.
So it was, and they had a very slender connection, or they were very impermanent, but in fact they survived. So most of the shows I watched.
You did watch.
I did watch them.
Did you get to love him?
Yeah, I got to love him, and I got, more importantly, I think, to respect him. I mean, a lot of the stuff that he did is just really brilliant and underappreciated.
Well, what you can tell from the writers who, I have a clip of all the writers talking, is that, and it's just sort of irresistible, is that they all worshiped him. He was their God. He was the one who taught them everything. And so even when he's doing these routines or that he's done and that they've seen many, many times before, they're howling. All of these very sophisticated writers who are, totally famous for their own work. But I let me see, I have, this is from the Admiral Review.
Yeah, this is very early.
All right, now she comes on.
I mean, that's interesting. That's a precursor of the German professor sketches,
Right.
where Karl Reiner was always the interviewer.
Well, here's the thing about a lot of these sketches, is that they're 20 minutes long, and the buildup is so slow and languorous that, it's amazing. They're 20 minutes long, which tells you something about America's ability to focus. And
Well, yeah, they got longer, in fact, because once Caesar was running his own operation, which was why Your Show of Shows ended, and Caesar was running his own show, he could make the segments as long as he wanted, and he was more ambitious. He resented on Your Show of Shows, people don't remember this. You'd
I
remember
do.
it, Foster, that it was a variety show.
It was a variety
Yeah.
show.
Well, look at this.
And opera.
There was opera, and there was dancing, singing and jumping, or screaming and jumping.
all
was-
right, now look at this. This is Imogene.
That's at the very beginning.
Sometime or other, what is known as the torch singers. Now, as you know, a torch singer is also
And the song goes on. But I put that in because it shows that Carol Burnett was totally influenced. I mean, it was a steal.
Yeah, that's right. And Carol Burnett said that when she was designing her show, she wanted to make it just like Your Show of Shows.
Yeah, but
Right.
why don't you talk a little bit about what television was like in that moment, that they could have an hour-and-a-half show?
And live. Talk about that.
And
live.
live. Well, I mean,
Live.
the first point to make is that, I hadn't seen that one. I watched these shows sequentially, and that's the Admiral Broadway Review, and that's at the very beginning. And this was the show that really made Imogene Coca famous, but she had been around a lot longer than Sid. She was 14 years older than Sid. So they were paired as a married couple, and everybody thought they were married, but they, in fact, they came from different generations, and she was much more experienced than Sid was. And they had a very interesting relationship, which was sort of a non-relationship. They understood one another telepathically on the stage. They anticipated one another's moves, and they knew what each other was going to do, and they had a lot of similarities. They were both kind of maladroit, both a little antisocial, very shy. Really? Yeah. But on the stage, they clicked. Off the stage, they had nothing to do with one another, and they didn't hang out together. There were famous after parties that Caesar had at Danny's Hideaway. Do you remember Danny's Hideaway? Barbara Stanwyck probably went to Danny's Hideaway.
You know, that's another subject.
Yeah.
You know, in your book, you say that they went on a train and didn't speak to it.
They performed at Eisenhower's first inauguration in March. No, it was January of by then they were in January of 1953. And they took the train down from New York together, and they didn't say a word to one another the whole trip.
And you make the interesting point that neither one, to save their lives, could tell a joke.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think Carl Reiner said he never heard Sid Caesar tell a joke. And Joe Sines said he never heard Sid Caesar laugh. So this is an unusual comedian. Well, this was not at the very beginning of your show of shows, because Camel, I think, was not a sponsor originally. But what happened, the reason your show of shows came along, it was sort of a continuation of the Admiral Broadway Review. But Admiral sold so many television sets that they figured they were going to put their money into making more television sets than into a television show. So they backed out, and then Max Liebman, who had produced the Admiral Broadway Review and who had developed this whole variety format at Camp Tamament, which people will remember, Max had already had a formula for television. I mean, in a way, as he said, he was doing television before there were television cameras.
Talk a little bit about Max Liebman, because he was obviously a genius.
Well, Max Liebman was a great spotter of talent and knew how to sort of juggle various acts and bring them together. He had already worked with Danny Kaye.
Right.
And he was the social director at Camp Tamament, which was like a minor league for Broadway. I mean,
And where was it?
It
Was
was
it in the
in the Poconos.
Oh, in the Poconos.
In the Poconos. Sid was never a Catskill comic. Sid had nothing to do with the Poconos, and he never went to Camp Tamament until many years later. But the formula for your show of shows was developed there. And the story was that, I mean, to answer your question, Vicki, television was like the Wild West. Television was one giant uncolonized phenomenon. They had to fill up all this time. And how do you get a 90-minute show? It's because Sylvester Pat Weaver, Sigourney's father, who was the executive at NBC, basically offered Max Liebman a show. And they were desperate to fill the time, and here was a man who already had the formula. He knew how to put together comedy and drama and opera and music and all of this kind of stuff, and he could just sort of import it from the Poconos to TV in New York. And there was a story about how he took out Caesar and Liebman to lunch one day and said, "Do you want 30 minutes, 60 minutes, or 90 minutes?" And Sid thought he was talking about how long he was going to wait to get their food, you know? But in fact, once they figured out what the question entailed, they grabbed the 90 minutes. Why wouldn't you take 90 minutes if you can get them?
90 live minutes.
90 live minutes, and that goes back to Foster's question about doing TV live with
week after week after
week after
But
week
wait a
after
minute, here's
week.
the thing, David. It was only live.
It was only no tape.
So
and
it's all TV.
even when they did a rerun, they didn't reach into these were kinescope. That was the way that it was preserved. But they never ran a kinescope on one of these shows. I mean, if they had to do a rerun, if a sketch fell apart at the last minute, Max Liebman would say, "Let's do the so-and-so routine again," and they'd look at the scripts for a couple of minutes and then do them. So there was absolutely no margin for error. One of the writers said it was like walking a tightrope across Niagara Falls week after week. And when we get to the part about the price, the toll that it took on Sid Caesar, much of it was concerned putting on a live show week after week, an unforgiving live show. Although if you watch these shows, you'll see that there are very, very few screw-ups. They were scripted, they were not improvised. the whole notion that was on My Favorite Year, among other places, of this mayhem on the set, that never happened. Never happened.
These were like trained athletes. I mean, in a way,
Yeah.
because they were used to it, they were geared up to it, their brains were up to it, and because there wasn't any other way that television existed. I mean, like, I remember Playhouse 90 and things
Yeah.
of that. They were all live.
But it just, I mean, Sid would describe, I mean, there's a description in the book of their weekly routine, you know, of coming in on Monday and saying, what'd you do over the weekend? And he got any ideas for a domestic sketch? And they would come up with a few ideas and start working on them, and there was a whole ritual. They had to get the music arranged, they had to get the stage sets built and all of this, and there was a process through every week. And then on Friday, the rehearsals started. On Saturday, they'd run through the show 3 different times, twice before it was actually performed. And then, as Caesar described it, on Sundays, he would just go in and stand under the shower for hours, you know, just sort of recovering from all of this.
And then Monday it started all over again.
And then Monday, it started all over again.
But, you know, you say at a certain point he was in demand at resorts and clubs across the United States, and he was at Vacation Land in Swan Lake, which I have to say is sort of in my neck
I
of the
think
woods.
that's close to where he met his wife, actually.
But what was it then that audience, because at a certain point Mel Brooks is saying he played the saxophone.
Well, Sid was a musician
Yeah, Sid played
before he was a comic, and Sid, I think in some ways thought of himself almost as much of a musician as a comic. I think he was more at home, given how maladroit he was, and how something that was, maybe you remember, he couldn't do his introductions at the beginning of the show, which was why the camel guy there was doing him a favor by introducing the guest host.
He
because
couldn't be himself.
Normally,
He
Sid
didn't
would
know how to define himself.
Yeah, he couldn't define himself, and Sid would come out at the beginning of the show and stammer through his introductions, and it was a real problem. They eventually had to get Hugh Downs to do that.
Were these East Coast shows the
Well,
original series?
when you show Imogene imitating a torch singer.
By the way, that's a real song.
Yeah, yeah.
Helen O'Connell and Jimmy Dorsey sang
That would not go over. That's a reflection of how TV was an urban, mostly Northeast phenomenon in its beginnings, which was why the Caesar show was so sophisticated.
But then once TV spread to the hinterlands, Caesar's popularity declined.
Right, and that's
when Lawrence Welk came.
Well, that's one of the things that a writer dreams of. And it turned out that when Sid was knocked off the air, it was by Lawrence Welk. Because television had spread to the hinterlands, as Foster said, and they could see Lawrence Welk coming. And Lawrence Welk, of course, epitomized the increasingly diverse TV audience, the direction in which TV was going. And they knew that Lawrence Welk, of all people, was an existential threat to them. And so Caesar's humor was generally very, very gentle. There's not a lot of biting satire. There was never anything topical. Eisenhower was mentioned once in the 8 years he was president. His name is mentioned once on the show. I mean, the humor was very gentle, usually, but not with respect to Lawrence Welk. And they did 3 different takeoffs on Lawrence Welk, and they're absolutely brutal.
Yeah, I don't have one of them.
No, because in fact, most of the great Caesar sketches are on YouTube, but those are not, for whatever reason.
But I'll tell you something, because the evolution from Lawrence Welk versus Sid Caesar was, and I remember this, I think it was Saturday or Sunday, I think it may have been Sunday, there was the Ed Sullivan show, and opposite Ed Sullivan was Steve Allen, and that was the divide.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the ironies is that Lawrence Welk, at least until recently, was on PBS, and Sid Caesar was not. Go figure. I never understood that.
When the last show of shows performed in 1954, I remember vividly, it was like a national tragedy.
Yeah.
You were losing your family.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right.
That's how
I
it
should have
felt.
I should have interviewed you.
That's how it felt.
Yeah, where were you
losing
when I
your
needed you?
family. Losing your family.
All right.
You know, I have to say, I want to gripe about something, which is that in the old days, and I did this for the book I did about Joe Louis and Max Schmeling, and I did it for the book on Strange Fruit. You could put an author's query in the New York Times Book Review, and you would hear from the Foster Hirsches of the world who had stories to tell, and it was great material.
I did
P.S.
that.
They don't run them anymore.
I did that with Stanwyck.
You know, can I, before you ask me a question, I just want to talk a little bit about Mel Brooks, which is hard because Mel takes, like kudzu, he takes over everything that he's connected to. But this is characteristically a mixture of fact and fiction, what he just said. Okay, he's describing, and it's charming, and sometimes it's like that line from Liberty Valance, when legend becomes fact, print the legend. The story, like the story of Sid holding him out the window in Chicago, that kind of thing.
Is that real?
Yeah. No. In my mind, it's not, but also to Caesar's wife, it was not. It was not. Florence Caesar didn't believe it.
But maybe Max Liebman did, because Max Liebman hated him.
Well, Max Liebman hated him for other reasons. I mean, Mel was easy to hate. Mel was very irritable. I mean, the old Mel can be irritable. You can imagine what the young Mel was like, But Mel is telling the story here of meeting Sid in the Catskills and jamming with him. Mel has two different stories about when he met Sid Caesar. Once was in the Catskills and once was during the war, before the war, 1942, and then the other one is after the war. I think the after the war story is right, so he wouldn't have been jamming with Sid Caesar in the Catskills. But other elements in that story are true.
I like that. I like the way you track that down. That's excellent. Let me just see.
Well, this is what you learn to care about when you're doing a book.
Yes.
David, your portrait of Mel Brooks in the book, he cooperated with you.
Yes,
He
I
gave
had
you
great interviews with him.
But you can read between the lines.
Yeah, again,
your admiration for him is not unending. Let's put it that way.
I'm sure some of you have seen the documentary, the Mel Brooks documentary on HBO. Well, some of you have seen it, and, they go into his relationship with Sid Caesar at great length, but it's the sanitized version.
Well, you're going to see there's some coming up.
Yeah, and the unsanitized, it's the balanced version, the nuanced version is in this book, because obviously they were attached to one another. I think it was Joe Stein who said they had a sadomasochistic relationship, and they each wanted to get away from one another regularly, and at one point Mel quit working for Sid. None of that is in the documentary. So their relationship was very, very intense.
Well, it must be in the book that somebody describes Mel Brooks as his valet.
Yeah, well, Max Liebman did, among other things. He had other descriptions. Another myth, if you go on 56th Street, where the city center is, you'll see a plaque memorializing Caesar's famous writer's room. There's only one problem: it wasn't in that building. It's on the outside of the building, but the famous writer's room, the writer's room of lore, the writer's room of laughter on the 23rd floor, that was in the Milgram building on 57th Street, which since torn down. Because on your show of shows, there were only 3 writers, so you wouldn't have much of a writer's room with only 3 writers. This is the writers, these are the writers in the writer's room for Caesar's Hour. You can see Neil Simon up in the upper left. You can see that's Mel Tolkien in the middle. That's Larry Gelbart on the right. That's Mike Stewart with the white sweater, who did Hello Dolly later and Bye Bye Birdie, and there's Mel Brooks. These are a couple more obscure writers who worked with Caesar, but that's this is the writer's room for Caesar's Hour,
So
the famous writer's room.
Do you want to talk a little bit about how, what went on? Because it sounds like it was both high jinks, low jinks, and sort of savage.
Well, that's right. I mean, again, there's a lot of mythology about the writer's room, and the way that it's been portrayed is either as the chaos of My Favorite Year, or the kind of sweet badinage of Neil Simon. And in fact, it was a pretty savage place. One of the writers, I don't think it's any of the guys in here, but one of them, one of the more marginal writers, described how, 2 years earlier, he'd been working in the corset business. These guys were second-generation American Jews. At one point, all 7 of Caesar's writers were Jewish, and always a very high percentage of them where there were token Gentiles, but basically his writers were Jewish. And they were all the children of immigrants. The specter that haunted them was the specter of 7th Avenue. If they weren't going to make it in show business, that's where they were heading. And so they were fighting for their lives in there, and it was a tough place. And the contemporaneous descriptions of it are much more honest than the kind of gauzy descriptions that have since developed. It was a Darwinian kind of place.
The Jewish writers, David, but you make a point, very convincingly, that there's very little direct Jewish humor or Yiddishkeit on the shows.
Yes, that's right.
Caesar avoided Jewishness as much as he avoided politics.
Yes, that's right.
Well, he may have avoided Jewishness, but it's totally throughout.
No, that's right. It's steeped in it, but it's not explicit.
And that's why Alty Carper published the book.
Yeah, that's right. Well, but that's right. There were, as Irving Howe said, there were lots of waves to the folks back home. Or as Sid said, the Jews knew that we were Jewish.
But a Jewish audience would know this is Jewish humor.
Absolutely,
but it
yeah.
wasn't marked as such.
No. Max Liebman was very proud that there wasn't a single Yiddish word used on your show of shows. Although that's not quite true, because in some of the German double talk, Schmutzig, there's Yiddish that worked its way in because the German was based on the Yiddish. The interesting thing was that Max was not impressed with the Caesar brothers. That was Danny Caesar to Neil's left, and did not keep them on. And later on, Sid ran into Neil at a New Year's party or something and sort of grabbed him by the face and said, "This brain, I want that brain." So when Sid ran his own show, he brought Neil Simon back.
But so did the brothers write together?
The brothers wrote briefly together on your show of shows when the woman in this picture, Lucille Callan, was pregnant.
And
these are the charter writers on your show of shows.
Right.
There's Sid, there's Mel Tolkien, that's Lucille Callan, and that's Mel Brooks.
Yes.
And the story is that the official writers, the imports from Tamament, were Mel Tolkien and Lucille Callan. Mel was this irritating guy who just came to where the show was put together it was put together on 56th Street in the city center and actually done at the site of the Coliseum on Columbus Circle. And Mel would just come around and sort of be an irritant and keep trying to get in and making noises outside of Sid's window and all of this. And eventually they let him in because Sid found Mel funny. And Mel brought a different kind of humor to the mix. Mel was more a Borscht Belt kind of guy. And so it was kind of merging the Borscht Belt with the more rarefied Pocono sensibility. And Max Liebman nonetheless found Mel to be an incredible pain in the ass. He refused to pay him. Sid had to pay him out of his own pocket.
$40.
And $40 or $50 a week. And for a long time, Max was kind of sadistic about it. He wouldn't put Mel in the credits, and then he put him in under additional material by Mel Brooks. And it took many months for Mel to become a full-fledged writer on the show.
But let me ask you about Lucille Callan. She was Canadian, and she was a writer. Like a novelist, was she not?
Well, she was later a mystery writer. She was not a writer principally. She was another musician, and she was from Toronto. Mel Tolkien was originally from Ukraine and then went to Canada. So both of his early writers were Canadian, which is an interesting twist, given that Lorne Michaels is Canadian, and you don't think of Canadians as very funny, but Sid managed to find a couple of them, or Max managed to find a couple of them.
How did she do in that room?
she was trampled, by all of the men. She and Coco were in cahoots. I mean, they sort of formed their own alliance in the room, because the men were kind of clueless 1950s men, and it was Mel Brooks, Sid Caesar, Carl Reiner, and Howard Morris, and they were and Max Liebman, and they were formidable. And I think that the only one who was ever really nice to Coca was Howard Morris. And because Howard Morris was the third banana, and he felt shat upon, right? So he sort of related to Coca, so they became great buddies.
You present Howard Morris as a very complaining figure.
Yeah, right.
He was really unhappy most of the time.
Because he felt underappreciated. I mean, he was a serious actor, and he was hired because he was little and could be tossed around. So he ended up getting smashed a lot and having his clothes torn off and that sort of thing. Which was why, whenever he saw an opening, he fought a kind of guerrilla war on the show where he was constantly trying to get more exposure. Are you going to show the Uncle Goopy sketch? Okay, so when we get to that, you'll see that was his great moment in The Sun, because that was his chance to really draw out his role, which he did. There was very little improvisation on the show, but there's one instance of it where Sid says, "Kind of rough tonight, ain't it?"
I couldn't figure out that line that he said.
Yeah, kind of rough tonight.
Made her laugh.
Yeah, and Sid was also very much opposed to breaking up on camera. He thought it was unprofessional, and sort of keeping a secret from the audience in a way, making it a private joke among the performers, and he was very down on it. He hated it. But here's an instant where, and normally his co-actors respected that, but in this instance, she's hit with an improvised line, and she can't resist, and she starts laughing, which is why she tucks herself into his shoulder.
But, I wanted to ask, in listening to this, do you think that the musicality, the fact that Sid Caesar was a musician, and Lucille Callan, who was, even though she was trampled, that these people, that this sort of musical aspect of their art had anything to do?
Yeah, I think it had a lot. I think that Mel Tolkien was a musician too. Several, and Mel Brooks was a drummer. I mean, there were several of them who were musicians. And I mean, Mel Tolkien, who was the head writer on Your Show of Shows and lasted for Caesar's entire reign and later worked on All in the Family, Michael Tolkien's father. Mel Tolkien said that the structure of a typical Caesar sketch was like a sonata. I mean, it was all structured, in pieces.
Because of the way it builds, also.
Yeah, exactly. So that there was an essential musicality to the work that they did. And there are other sketches. I mean, one of the most amazing sketches, and I don't mean to steal your thunder, Vicky. Maybe you're going to show this one too. Caesar was a great pantomimist. Again, instinctively, he was never trained to be. And there's a marvelous routine where he plays a concert pianist performing Grieg's Piano Concerto. And
I don't have it.
And good. Backstage, for Caesar's own show, again, he was running his own operation. He hired Earl Wild, who was a serious concertizer, a serious musician, a performer. And he was playing Grieg's Piano Concerto backstage, and Sid was, just playing the notes. And it was very clear that Sid knew that piece inside out. He knew all the notes, so he knew just where to play a wrong note that Earl Wild would play backstage. So there are a lot of musical pieces in the show. There's also, when Nanette Fabre came on the show, she was after Imogene left, and Nanette Fabre was the female star on Caesar's Hour. There's a pantomime, it's a marital argument to the first movement of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. They don't say anything; they're just gesturing. They're gesturing along with the music of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Now, just imagine. I mean, this is going on at the same time that Lawrence Welk is doing his champagne music on 2 channels away. I mean, imagine performing a piece like this in contemporary mainstream television. This is clearly a remnant of an age where television had an urbane audience and urbane performers. that's one of the great moments in Caesar's run. And I hate to throw cold water on it, but there is some suggestion that it was not spontaneous. I could never pin that down, but Mel Tolkien in one interview sort of hinted that part of it was that it might have been planned, and Mel Brooks also sort of suggested it. But again, the legend is better than the fact, and whether it was planned or not, imagine drawing a tic-tac-toe board while looking in a mirror. Everything is reversed, and you have 20 million people watching you, and he X's win on the top line. I mean, he's thinking all of this while all of these people are looking in, and he's singing at the same time, and he's keeping time because all of these sketches had to come in on time. And it's a miraculous achievement. And the only other point I would make is that panel that you're showing, which was a reunion of all of the writers on Caesar's Hour that was held in Los Angeles around in the 1990s, I think, was organized by Larry Gelbart, who's the man who tells the story there. And when he was planning it, he almost did not invite Sid Caesar to this reunion of Caesar's writers. Why? Because Sid was unpredictable, and he didn't know whether he'd catch Sid on a good night or not. And he had to be persuaded to invite Sid Caesar there.
Oh, you're kidding.
No, it's in the book. I mean,
talk a little bit about, let's talk about Caesar and the range of complexity.
Yeah, well, Caesar was a difficult man to read. And, you say that they all worshipped him. They worshipped him, but they were also afraid of him, and they were mostly perplexed by him. And there's a quote from Carl Reiner in an oral history where he says that, when he wasn't around, we'd all sit there and try to figure out what made him go, what made him tick. No one really understood him. Early on, even before he started doing television, he started to drink. And that's what sort of propelled him. After he came out of the shower on Sunday mornings, that was one of the things that propelled him, that kept him going week after week. And one of the things that you notice when you watch all of the shows consecutively is that you can see his performances start to get more and more frayed. He starts to look a little bit different. We haven't shown any of the incredible verbal things that he's done where he has these monologues. What made him famous was this sketch where he plays all the different parts in an aviator in a dogfight movie.
Right.
In the movie called Tarzan Spars. This was before he went on television. And he plays the German pilot and the American pilot and the British pilot, but he also plays their planes and the different sounds of the planes. A Nazi bomber sounds different from a Nazi bomber snarls and an American plane purrs, and he's doing all of this. And there's another routine that he does where he's describing the difference in called $5 Date, another one of his famous sketches. And these are marathon soliloquies. And he started to do them very early on, and they're what everybody noticed, and everybody noticed that there was this genius coming up. That's why he got these television gigs. But in order to keep himself going, he started to drink very early in his career, and it got worse and worse. And when in the later shows on Caesar's Hour, what's striking about them is, first of all, they're better written. They're better written than any of the stuff on your show of shows. And to go back to your point, Vicki, they're longer. Okay, some of them took up almost an entire show. There's one marvelous takeoff on a silent movie called A Drunk There Was. And
I don't have that.
You don't have
No.
that? Anyway, it's a takeoff, pardon my ignorance, it wasn't Barbara Stanwyck in Stella Dallas. It's a takeoff of Stella Dallas. Okay, where Caesar is a drunk man who wants to preserve his daughter's opportunities, and if the word gets out that he's a drunk, her boyfriend is going to drop her and all of this, so he arranges to place his daughter in the home of a millionaire, and just in order to protect her from him and his reputation. And it's just this marvelous, absolutely marvelous sketch. And Caesar is fine in that sketch because he doesn't have to say anything. But in some of the other sketches done around the same time, you can see that he's starting to stammer. This is a man who could do 8-minute soliloquies uninterruptedly, and all of a sudden, he's starting to speak the way that he spoke when he introduced people early on in his career. He can't get out of line. So the alcohol, and plus the alcohol, when added to the pills that he would take to try to get to sleep at night, and as he said, to turn his brain off, it all caught up with him.
But what about this? I mean, the thing is that here's Larry Gelbart, who describes him as you say this, that he had zero non-existent personality.
Yeah, right.
And Neil Simon says he was extremely smart, but completely inarticulate.
Yeah, right.
And how do you, you've been, you've thought about him, you've investigated, and you've had to piece this whole thing together. So how do you put those two, and with that genius, how do you put it all together?
You just realize it was like what Foster said before. When he couldn't introduce people, you see him run off the stage, and he's running off the stage to get into the first sketch, but he's also getting away from himself. He was in a different zone when he was performing.
But a fascinating double line in your book is you recreate episodes and skits, and I'm sitting there reading them, laughing out loud, the genius of the comedy. But you're aware throughout the book that this is a very troubled, tormented man.
Well,
who almost had not a moment of true happiness.
Yeah, well, one of
of
my readers, Marvin Siegel, the former culture editor at the Times, one of my old colleagues, said, "I've never laughed so much over so sad a book."
But
there are both sides in there.
You don't present him as a man who had any contentment or joy in his success or his genius.
But the fact is that when he can't get to sleep at night, his mind is going.
He's reliving the last show and anticipating the next show.
It's sort of an impossible thing for a human being to take on.
Yeah, he's doing a post-mortem and a pre-mortem. Now, that's the sketch that I've probably seen 300 times and dissected. It's at the beginning of the book. It's the most famous Caesar sketch. It's the takeoff on This Is Your Life. As I said, it was Howard Morris's greatest performance, his moment in the sun. There were lots of people on Caesar's show who never topped what they did for Sid. And one of them, I would say, is Carl Reiner. Carl Reiner had an incredibly illustrious and successful career. But the work he did on Caesar's show is just astonishing, including on this sketch, because he's running this sketch. And there's in this instance, there's a lot of improvisation going on, and he manages to keep it under control, and he brings it in on time, which is just miraculous.
But you present Carl Reiner as a master politician.
Yes,
he knew
right.
how to handle Sid Caesar,
right.
And he also knew how to mask his own feelings.
Yes, that's
in the way
right.
that Howard Morris didn't.
I got to tell you, Foster, it's so nice to be interviewed by somebody who really read the book. and if you remember those details, I'm so grateful to both of you for dissecting what's in there and remembering it.
But that was interesting, because you do talk a lot about how he hid his feelings. While he's trying to figure out Sid Caesar, he's also doing the same thing.
That's just
hidden man.
It was actually in the wake of the murder of his son and daughter-in-law. I had a chance to think a lot about all of this and to reflect on. Everybody thought that Carl Reiner was a very sunny guy, and that was always the image that he presented, but he was a more complicated guy than that.
And what was going on behind that for him?
Well, what was going on was that his family were poor immigrants, that his father's family, he had several relatives who were killed in the Holocaust. His sister-in-law was a Holocaust survivor, the wife of Carl's younger brother. And in fact, his daughter-in-law was the daughter of a Holocaust survivor.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So he had a lot of tragedy in his life, and he was just somebody who masked it by being diplomatic and keeping a certain distance in all of his performances, which is why he was the master reporter in all of the Professor sketches. He's always the man with the microphone interviewing other people.
But the pleasantness was a mask.
It was a mask, and he actually acknowledged that.
He says that. He says that.
He actually acknowledged it, and it's puzzling. That interview was really kind of amazing, and it's in the collection at the New York Public Library, and it was done for the American Jewish Committee, an oral history that he gave, I think, in the 1980s, and I think he probably gave it with the assurance that it was going to be embargoed for a long time, because he really leveled in that interview. I mean, I think I would have assumed there was more to the guy than that, but there he was actually
But don't you
confirming
think
it.
Don't you think the perfect metaphor is the toupee?
Yeah, well, that's right. But even I said in the book that he was a natural performer, and even on his head, even a toupee looked good. There's no such thing as a good toupee, but he seemed to have
He
one.
had a natural toupee.
Yeah, he had an actual toupee.
Did Sid
Okay, look.
Caesar's talent evaporate?
It burned up.
There was no other choice.
It was eaten. It was
sustain that.
it burned up in public. I mean, it was just consumed. It was
Consumed.
It was
But you
consumed.
see him in the late movies, Mad, Bad, Mad World
Right,
and
yeah.
Grease, and he's okay, but you don't know
You watch him in the 60s and the 70s. It's really interesting. All of these different people, Vicky said this before, everybody felt a great debt to Sid Caesar, and everybody wanted to honor him, and not just the people who worked for him, who had mixed feelings about him, but knew he was great, and knew that their careers had, that he had helped make their careers. But even competitors like Jackie Gleason, who were not great people and not always nice people, tried to prop him up. I mean, he was really a shell for many years. And you watch him Dick Cavett had him on his interview shows when he could barely get a sentence out. I mean, his brain was really fried for many, many years. And then finally, and Johnny Carson had him on. Some of you will remember when 10 from Your Show of Shows was released theatrically in the 1970s, and Sid sort of made a brief comeback. Johnny Carson had him on his show several times. Everybody wanted to prop him up because everybody felt a great debt to him, and everybody felt that history had sort of forgotten him. And that's the reason why, incidentally, that I think Mel Brooks talked to me as long as he did, and why Woody Allen talked to me.
Well, tell that Woody Allen anecdote.
Yeah, well, Woody Allen comes into the story late. Caesar, after Caesar's hour is off, there's a brief reprise with an Imogene Coca show that lasted a few episodes, and then they did various specials in 1958 and 1959. On one of these specials, it was the only time that Woody Allen and Mel Brooks worked together on a show. And oddly enough, it was the first time. I said that Caesar was a purist. Caesar didn't like anything artificial or anything inauthentic, and that included laugh tracks. He was very much opposed to laugh tracks. He thought they were really cheating, but it was the special that, written by Woody Allen and Mel Brooks, was the first time a laugh track was ever used on a Sid Caesar show. And I say in the book, can you imagine? They didn't trust these two guys working together to supply enough laughs, so they had to put a laugh track on that. Anyway, Woody Allen comes along at the tail end of Caesar's run in 59 and 1960. And he has stories. I mean, Sid had a thing about guns, and Sid brought a loaded gun to the writer's room and started waving it around. I mean, Woody Allen had horror stories of what it was like to be around Caesar. Caesar also wanted to work on the special with Larry Gelbart and Woody Allen in the Schwitz in his house in Long Island, in the steam bath, and wanted Woody Allen to go into the steam bath and work with the two of them, and Woody Allen refused to do that. Anyway. But Woody felt that Caesar had a great influence on him, even in the short time that they worked together. And many years later, when Sid and Imogene were appearing together at Michael's Pub, Woody Allen and Dick Cavett went to hear them, and went backstage and had a great time and enjoyed them. Sid and Imogene were sort of tied together. They couldn't get away from one another because people wanted to see them together until the very end. Anyway, Woody and Cavett went backstage afterwards to compliment Caesar and Coca for their performance, and he said Caesar told him, just imagine, I'm going to be a footnote in your career. This is what Sid Caesar told Woody Allen. And Woody replied, what are you talking about? You're Sid Caesar. You're like the greatest comic who ever lived. Everybody admired you. What are you talking about? And it was just a wonderful story, and I was so thrilled when he told me that, when he shared it with me.
Well, that's a Pagliacci moment.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
But you actually met Sid Caesar.
I interviewed him twice. Yes, I interviewed him on consecutive days when I first started the book, and I don't like to say how long it took me, but Alti knows. The interview was in 2008, and in fairness, and Alti knows this, that I did several other projects in the meantime. I wasn't working.
You don't have to make excuses.
Yeah, no, I know, but I feel as if I do,
company.
just from my reputation. What was the question?
Well, here's a question that I have for you, which is, these are all on Kinescope.
Yeah.
And there's no, as far as I can see, there's absolutely no reason why these can't be somehow digitized and cleaned up and put on television, like on TV.
Yeah, well, they have been cleaned up. They're on DVDs. Most of the great sketches are on DVDs. They could easily be shown on television. They were not, because they weren't done on film and because they weren't bite-sized like I Love Lucy or The Honeymooners, which were done on film and half-hour bite-sized things, convenient. They were syndicated and Sid was not, which was another reason why he just disappeared. And yeah, these things could be shown. I think what resurrected Caesar was YouTube.
Right.
Because,
right.
as I say, most of the great sketches are on YouTube.
All right, let's
My
just...
question was, what was Sid Caesar like in person?
Oh, yeah, that was the
when you were
question,
sitting
yeah. No, Sid was one of the few people who got more verbal and articulate the older he got.
Well, but he understood himself.
Well, it wasn't just that he understood himself, it was that he stopped drinking, he cleaned up. He became a fitness freak. So when you see these interviews with him, he's almost eloquent. I mean, he actually tells a good story, and he can string sentences together. And when I spoke to him, I had it was very early in the thing because he was old and he wasn't well, although he lived another 6 years, and I felt I had to get to him quickly, and I got to him before I knew all the questions to ask him. And when I went back and listened to it again, I was surprised at how good the interview was and how much good material I got, including the story about Barney Greengrass, which was that Sid, when Sid was riding high, he was like an iconic figure to Jewish America. He was the success story. Everybody was living vicariously through him. And there were all these articles about his fancy house in Kings Point and all the suits that he had and the limousine that he drove and the pinky ring that he once lost in the gutter, and somebody didn't return it to him right away because he thought it was too big and bright to be real. Sid was living very high. Bought a place on Park Avenue before he moved to the suburbs, but he said, and I told him that, I said everybody was living vicariously through you, but his example of what he knew he had really made it when he could go to Barney Greengrass and buy as much sturgeon as he damn well pleased, even though it was $5 a pound.
Okay, so that brings...
So we played that tape at Barney Greengrass at my book party.
So that brings me to this question, which we haven't talked about, which you just brought up, which is the issue of food. Yeah. Because Carl Reiner tells us, I mean, he was Sid Caesar was big and eventually lost all that weight, but Reiner tells a story, which you have in the book, or no, I don't know if it's in the book, I don't think it was actually, where his brother would come and lay out this huge trays of food in the writer's room, and the writers would be telling the jokes, and as he was laying out the food, Caesar's brother would sort of be nodding for a good joke, doing this, shaking his head for a bad joke. But the issue of food, which there's so much deprivation of food in these clips.
Yeah.
And his father did have this cafeteria or coffee shop in Yonkers. Right. So talk a little bit about that, because...
Well, you've already sort of given it away in a way.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay, Vicki. I mean, and the point is that a lot of Jewish humor revolves around food, and I have a whole passage in the book. If I knew the page number, I'd read it because it's not very long, but it's just about the Jewish obsession with food.
Well, you have that quote from Mimi Sheraton.
Well, I'm getting to that.
Okay.
Which is that, yes, many of the best sketches revolve around food. And, there's the famous sketch in the boardroom where Howard Morris is waving the pickle under Sid's nose, and Sid the boss is stricken because everybody else gets his sandwich but him. And then you started to show another sketch in a health food restaurant where Imogene, who's sort of a social climber in their domestic sketches, wants to take Sid to show Sid a health food restaurant. And Sid, of course, is a meat and potatoes kind of guy, and all he wants is a steak. And he's absolutely stricken because he has to go to this health food restaurant. It's like Woody Allen with Diane Keaton 20 years later. Although it's really a more developed sketch, it's a wonderful sketch, and there are lots of things about food. And that was what I asked Mimi Sheraton. I interviewed her on this very question, and I said, everybody has to eat. What is it about Jews and food? Like the Italians, if you watch The Sopranos, they're always eating. Sid was always eating on the show. It was always real food. There was never, and I think it was partly that they were fressers, they were all serious eaters, and it was partly that the show was picking up the tab so they could all eat as much as they wanted. But I said to her, the Italians love food as much as the Jews. What is it about what's the difference? And she said, the Italians are just like the Jews, but without the panic. And that goes back to the deprivation.
But you describe his eating rituals. It's sort of terrifying.
Yeah, right, yeah.
A man out of control.
Yes, a man out of control, and he later recognized that. I think there was a line that he said in a later interview, and what is it? Something about you can take out all your aggression on a chicken, or something like that. It was a form of aggression.
Look, let's thank David for a fabulous event.
Thank you.
Let's thank David for writing a magnificent book, which is for sale in the back.
And it's for sale, and he will
Fabulous.
sign copies.